The Tlixians were a peaceful race living on a quiet planet orbiting a beautiful yellow star. They were small, soft-bodied creatures who had no natural defenses. For centuries, they relied on other alien species to protect them. Their planet, Tlixian, was a paradise filled with crystal blue lakes and lush green forests. The Tlixians loved art, music, and storytelling, but their technology was limited. They had never built warships or powerful machines because they believed kindness was the greatest strength. But even kindness couldn't stop their disaster. Their sun, a once steady star, had begun to collapse. It was dying, pulling Tlixian closer with its powerful gravity. Huge earthquakes shook the ground. The oceans raged with towering waves. Storms with lightning that tore the skies made it impossible to fly their small ships. Tlixian's surface was breaking apart, and its people had no way to escape. Desperate, the Tlixians sent out a distress signal into the galaxy. They begged for help from their allies, the great races who had always promised to protect them. They called the Zarvath Empire, whose massive fleet patrolled the galaxy. They called the Lorek Unity, famous for their advanced science, and they even called the Yetrin, their closest trade partners. But the replies brought only despair. The Zarvath said it was too dangerous to send ships into a collapsing system. The Lorek claimed they were too far to reach them in time. And the Yetrin? They simply ignored the message, too afraid to risk their own lives. The Tlixians gathered in their cities, holding each other, as their planet began to crumble. "No one is coming," Olvar, their leader, whispered with tears in his large black eyes. But far away, the message traveled further than anyone expected. It crossed the cold void between stars until it reached an unexpected destination. Earth. Humanity, known across the galaxy as Deathworlders, had a reputation. They came from a planet full of dangers, wild predators, poisonous plants, unstable weather, and diseases. No other species lived on a planet so harsh, and no other species was as tough as humans. They were seen as reckless, aggressive, and stubborn. Many aliens feared them. When the distress call reached the United Nations Space Command, some thought it was a mistake. "Why should we care about a small race in a far-off system?" asked one officer. But Admiral Alina Veros thought differently. She read the message and saw the Tlixians' pain. She knew what it was like to face hopeless odds. "We are Deathworlders," she said to her crew. "We survive the impossible. If we don't help them, who will?" Within hours, her fleet, the Resolute and its battle group, set a course for Tlixian. Humanity's fastest and toughest ships headed straight for the collapsing star. For the Tlixians, hope was on its way. For the galaxy, humanity was about to show what Deathworlders were truly made of. The Resolute and its fleet sped through the vast emptiness of space, engines roaring with the power of a species unafraid of danger. On the bridge of the flagship, Admiral Alina Veros studied the readings on the holodisplay. The collapsing star near Tlixian was already in its final stages. Its gravity was growing unstable, and bursts of solar plasma flared out, destroying anything unlucky enough to be nearby. The crew whispered among themselves. Everyone had heard stories about dying stars tearing apart whole planets. Rescuing an entire species from such a disaster seemed impossible. But Veros stood firm, her steel-gray eyes scanning the data. She had been through countless battles in her life, wars against pirates, hostile alien fleets, and even nature itself. To her, this wasn't just another mission. It was a test of humanity's values. "Prepare the fleet," she commanded. "We will not fail." Humanity's decision to respond to the distress call spread quickly across the galactic community. Many alien diplomats and leaders were shocked. "They're mad," scoffed a Zarvath ambassador during a council meeting. "Only humans would risk their lives for creatures as weak as the Tlixians." "Their ego blinds them," added a Lorek scientist. "They think they're heroes, but they're just reckless." Despite the criticism, humanity didn't stop. They sent out a message to the Tlixians, assuring them that help was on the way. On Tlixian, the response was met with disbelief. "They're really coming?" asked one of the Tlixian elders, his voice trembling. Olvar, the Tlixian leader, read the human message again. He couldn't understand why a species with such a dangerous reputation would bother helping them. Stories about humans had painted them as violent and unpredictable, yet here they were, promising to save a race that had nothing to offer in return. Still, hope flickered in Olvar's heart. "Prepare our people," he said. "If they truly come, we must be ready to cooperate." As the human fleet neared the Tlixian system, the situation grew worse. The collapsing star sent waves of radiation and gravity shocks that rattled even the Resolute's shields. Several smaller ships in the fleet had to retreat to safer positions. Admiral Veros knew they couldn't afford delays. She called her senior officers for a meeting. "Here's the plan," she began, projecting a 3D map of Tlixian and its unstable sun. "We'll deploy planetary shields to stabilize the atmosphere and slow the destruction. Meanwhile, our teams will land on the surface to evacuate the population. It'll be tight, but we can do it." Her officers nodded, their expressions grim but determined. One young lieutenant hesitated. "Admiral, what if the planet collapses before we finish?" Veros fixed him with a sharp gaze. "Then we hold the line. Humanity doesn't abandon the helpless. Not now, not ever." With that, the fleet plunged into the danger zone, ready to defy the odds. The Resolute emerged from hyperspace, followed by the rest of the human fleet. The view from the ship's observation deck was terrifying. Tlixian's sun loomed ahead, swollen and unstable. Bright streaks of plasma flared out from its surface like fiery whips, lashing at the surrounding space. The planet Tlixian itself was trembling, its once beautiful blue and green surface scarred by massive earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and raging storms. On the bridge, Admiral Elena Veros stood tall as her crew worked furiously around her. "Status report," she ordered. "Gravitational instability is worse than we expected," said Lieutenant Carson, the ship's navigation officer. "The sun's collapse is accelerating. We might have less than 48 hours before the entire system is destroyed." Veros nodded, her face calm but determined. "And the planet?" Commander Samara, the chief science officer, replied grimly, "The atmosphere is deteriorating. Massive storms are covering most of the surface. Radiation levels are rising, and the planet's crust is fracturing. It's barely holding together." The Admiral's voice was firm. "Then we don't waste time. Deploy the planetary stabilizers and shields immediately. Prepare the landing teams for evacuation operations." As the fleet moved into position, Tlixian's surface came into clearer view. The Tlixians were in chaos. From the ground, humans could see cities crumbling, with terrified Tlixians huddling in the remains of their homes. Massive tidal waves swept across coastal regions, and entire forests were consumed by raging fires. The Tlixian leader, Olvar, watched the human ships from a small underground shelter. His people had gathered around him, trembling with fear. They had always believed their fragile lives would one day end peacefully. But now, destruction was everywhere, and survival seemed impossible. "Do you think they will come down here?" one Tlixian elder asked, his voice shaking. Olvar hesitated. He had never trusted the stories about humans, beings from a death world, wild and aggressive. But now, watching the fleet risking their ships near a dying sun, he felt a flicker of hope. "They wouldn't have come this far if they didn't mean to help," he replied softly. On board the Resolute, Admiral Veros gave her next command. "Launch rescue shuttles. We'll send teams to the largest population centers first. Prioritize children and elders for evacuation. Make every second count." Commander Eric Trask, leading the first rescue team, nodded as he prepared to descend to the planet's surface. He checked his team's equipment, radiation suits, stabilizer beacons, and supplies for the frightened aliens. "All right, people," he said to his squad. "We're going into a war zone, but it's not a war. These people need us to be calm, strong, and fast. Let's show them what humanity is made of. As the shuttles plunged through the stormy atmosphere, Olvar and his people looked up at the sky, seeing bright trails of human ships descending like falling stars. For the first time in days, the Tlixians dared to believe they might survive. The human shuttles descended through Tlixian's thick atmosphere, battling fierce winds and lightning. Commander Eric Trask gripped the controls of the lead shuttle as it rocked from side to side, narrowly avoiding the swirling storm clouds. He could see the planet's surface below, scared by destruction. Collapsed buildings, cracked earth, and flooded valleys. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of burning wood and metal. "This isn't going to be easy," Trask muttered to his team. "But we don't have a choice." His crew nodded, their faces set with determination. They had trained for missions like this, tough, dangerous rescues. But nothing could have prepared them for the sheer scale of the disaster unfolding on Tlixian. The shuttle's hull groaned as it passed through another layer of storm, but it held together. Finally, the landing zone came into view. An old Tlixian city, half buried by rubble. The people were gathered in the streets, huddled together for warmth and safety. The winds howled, and the ground beneath them trembled as more aftershocks rumbled. Trask's team deployed the shuttle's landing gear and touched down with a thud, the impact shaking them all. The hatch opened, and the rescue team rushed out, weapons in hand, ready for anything. The city was eerily quiet for a moment before a crowd of terrified Tlixians emerged from the wreckage. At the front of the crowd was Olvar, the Tlixian leader. He watched the humans with wide eyes, his body tense. He had heard stories of the humans' ruthlessness and strength, but now, seeing them in action, he felt a mixture of awe and fear. One of Trask's team members, Sergeant Maya Lin, approached Olvar. "We're here to help," she said, her voice calm and steady. "We'll get you out of here." Olvar's eyes flickered with disbelief. You came, even knowing the danger." Sergeant Lin smiled gently. "We're human. Danger's part of the job." The Tlixian leader hesitated, still unsure whether to trust these strangers from a death world. But as he looked into Lin's eyes, he saw something he hadn't expected: kindness. "Then we must move quickly," he said, his voice trembling. "There is little time." Trask joined them, speaking in a loud, clear voice. "All right, listen up. We need to get everyone to the evacuation zone. Fast. The sun's collapsing, and we have to beat the wave." The humans quickly began organizing the Tlixians, using their advanced tech to carry injured civilians and elderly through the destruction. The humans' calm professionalism made a sharp contrast to the chaos around them. The Tlixians, once afraid and confused, began to trust them. Suddenly, a loud explosion echoed from the distance. A shockwave rattled the ground beneath their feet. "The star's gravity is pulling too hard on the planet," Trask said, scanning his display. "We're running out of time." As the team pushed forward, Olvar stayed close to Trask, his voice full of emotion. "We never imagined that humans would come to save us." Trask glanced at him and smiled. "Well, we're here now, and we're not leaving without you." The shuttle pilots sent word that more Tlixians were waiting, and the evacuation continued. Faster now, driven by the urgency of the situation. The first true bond of trust had been forged between humanity and the Tlixians, born in the heat of disaster. The human fleet hovered just outside Tlixian's atmosphere, the dying sun casting an eerie orange glow over the planet's surface. On the bridge of the Resolute, Admiral Alina Veros looked at the countdown timer ticking away in front of her. Less than 24 hours remained until the star's collapse would reach its deadly climax. "We can't afford to wait much longer," Veros muttered, her eyes scanning the reports from the surface. The evacuation was underway, but it was far from smooth. The gravitational pull of the collapsing sun had warped Tlixian's surface, making it almost impossible to land in many areas. Entire cities had disappeared into chasms. The remaining population was scattered and disoriented. The last survivors were holed up in remote regions, unwilling to leave their homes. On the surface, Commander Eric Trask's team worked nonstop, moving civilians from one makeshift shelter to the next. They had already evacuated thousands, but it wasn't enough. Every moment they spent rescuing the Tlixians was a moment the star's gravity was getting closer to consuming them all. Trask glanced at the stormy sky above as the winds picked up. A new wave of plasma from the sun had begun to surge toward the planet, visible as a bright line of red in the atmosphere. The radiation levels were rising. It wouldn't be long before it reached the surface, and everything would burn. "We need to move faster," Trask said, gripping his comm unit. "Get the last evac points organized. We can't lose any more time." Sergeant Maya Lin, his trusted second-in-command, looked up from her display. "We've got a problem, Commander. The southern zone is already being hit by radiation. It's too dangerous to land any more shuttles. We'll have to walk it from here." Trask took a deep breath. There was no time to argue. He turned to Olvar, who had insisted on staying behind to help coordinate the evacuation. The Tlixian leader was exhausted, his body shaking from the constant tremors and the pressure of the planet's collapse. "You'll need to lead the rest of your people out through the valley," Trask said, his voice firm. "We'll protect you, but you've got to move fast." Olvar nodded, his heart heavy. "I never thought we would have to rely on others for our survival," he said quietly. "But I will not let you down." The team split up, pushing forward into the crumbling landscape. Each step felt like an eternity as the world around them trembled. The ground shook beneath their feet as the first shockwave of radiation hit. They could see the sky flickering, the stars turning to a blinding red. The end was near. As they moved through the thickening smoke and dust, Trask couldn't help but think about how humanity had become the protectors. Once seen as aggressive invaders, the humans were now the ones offering life to those in need. By the time they reached the final shelter, the storm of radiation was nearly upon them. The last group of survivors, a family of elderly Tlixians, was waiting, huddled together. "Get them to the shuttle," Trask ordered. "We're almost out of time." As the shuttle lifted off, the last of the Tlixians were carried to safety. The sun's final collapse could no longer be stopped, but humanity had done what seemed impossible. They had saved the Tlixians from certain death. The Resolute and the rest of the human fleet hovered above Tlixian, their engines idling in the cold space. From space, the planet looked like a dying thing, a world slowly being torn apart. Radiation from the collapsing sun bathed the surface in an eerie red glow. The countdown on Admiral Vero's command screen was ticking away. Only a few hours remained until the star would collapse completely, consuming everything in its path. Admiral Vero stood at the front of the bridge, staring out at the view of the planet below. The evacuation was nearly complete. Over 80% of the Tlixian population had been safely transported to the human ships, but not all. There were still small groups stranded on the planet's surface, trapped in areas too unstable for shuttles to reach. "We're running out of time," Vero said quietly. She had already given the order to send out more rescue teams, but the situation was getting worse by the minute. The star's collapse was accelerating, and the planet was shaking violently. The remaining Tlixians were scattered in hidden pockets, and the radiation storms were becoming more intense. "Admiral, the last of the evacuation ships are ready for departure," reported Lieutenant Carson from the navigation station. "But there are still civilians in Sector 7. They're trapped in an old temple near the city ruins. It's too dangerous for the shuttles to land there." Veros clenched her fists, frustration crossing her face. "We don't have time for this. We need to find a way to get them out." She looked at her crew, determination setting in. The humans had already risked everything to save the Tlixians, and they weren't going to stop now. "I'll lead the team," Veros said, her voice steady. "Prepare a shuttle. I'm going in myself." The crew exchanged surprised glances, but no one spoke. They had seen the Admiral face countless battles, but this was something different. This wasn't a fight against an enemy. It was a race against nature itself. But if anyone could do it, it was Veros. Within minutes, Veros was in her flight suit, ready to descend to the surface. The shuttle was prepped, and her crew was ready. As the shuttle took off, the crew watched from the Resolute. "I've got a bad feeling about this," said Sergeant Maya Lin, who had joined Veros on many dangerous missions. "You're not the only one," Trask replied. The shuttle broke through the atmosphere and dove into the storm, dodging waves of radiation as it descended. The ruined city below looked like a graveyard, empty streets, crumbling buildings, and fires still burning. The temple in Sector 7 stood at the heart of the destruction, its spires rising into the red sky like the fingers of a dying world. When they landed, Veros and her team stepped out into the hot, toxic air. The ground was shaking violently now, and the sky flickered with radiation bursts. They moved quickly, searching for the trapped Tlixians. Inside the temple ruins, a small group of frightened civilians waited. When they saw the humans, they let out a collective sigh of relief. "You came for us," one of them whispered. Veros nodded. "We're not leaving anyone behind." With the last of the Tlixians safely on board, Veros ordered the shuttle to return to the fleet. As they lifted off, the star's final explosion lit up the sky, a brilliant, deadly light. The collapse was here. The shuttle doors closed, and the Resolute moved into position, preparing to jump out of the system. The danger was not over, but the humans had done what they came to do. They had saved a dying race. The human fleet gathered in orbit, their engines running silently as they watched the final moments of Tlixian unfold. Admiral Veros stood on the bridge of the Resolute, her eyes fixed on the view of the dying sun. The star had reached its critical stage. It was now a massive, unstable ball of energy, ready to implode and take everything in its path. "We've evacuated everyone we can," Veros said, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "There's nothing more we can do for the planet." Her crew nodded grimly. They had given everything, time, resources, energy, to save the Tlixians. And they had succeeded. Over 90% of the population was now safely aboard the human ships, transported to a nearby system for refuge. But the cost had been high. Many of their shuttles and support craft had been damaged or destroyed during the evacuation. Several crew members had been injured during the rescue, and the toll of the constant radiation had taken a heavy toll on the fleet. But the mission was not over. "Status report," Veros called out, her eyes never leaving the screen. "We're still receiving communication from the remaining Tlixian ships," Lieutenant Carson replied, his voice sharp. "They're ready to move once the collapse begins, but they'll need guidance. Their technology isn't advanced enough to navigate through the radiation storm." Veros turned to her science officer, Commander Samara. "Can we assist them?" she asked. Samara nodded. "We have the capability to create a navigation corridor using our fleet's shields. It won't be easy, but we can guide them out. It's a risk, but it's the only option." Veros made her decision quickly. "Do it. We'll hold the line until every last one of them is clear." In the distance, Tlixian's sun was now a swirling mass of unstable energy. It flared once, sending a massive shockwave rippling through the system. The fleet's shields flared to life, protecting the ships from the powerful surge. The shockwave passed, but the sun was still collapsing, and time was running out. The remaining Tlixian ships began to move, their engines sputtering weakly as they tried to escape the planet's final death throes. Human ships positioned themselves in front of the Tlixian fleet, using their shields to create a protective barrier from the radiation storm. The Resolute led the way, guiding the lost ships through the chaos. The tension on the bridge was palpable. The crew worked tirelessly, making real-time adjustments to their shields as the shockwaves from the collapsing star grew stronger. Every few minutes, the Resolute was rocked by a violent shake as another wave of energy swept through the area. Admiral Veros gritted her teeth as she held the fleet together. "We're almost there," she said, her voice filled with determination. "Stay with me." Suddenly, an alert flashed on the screen. A Tlixian ship, the last in line, was caught in the radiation storm. It was losing power. "Shields at maximum," Veros ordered, her heart racing. The Resolute's shields flared as it surged forward to protect the stricken ship. But the power was too much, and the Tlixian ship began to break apart. "No," Veros shouted. She watched in horror as the ship disintegrated, but there was nothing they could do. The shockwave from the collapsing star was too strong. But the rest of the fleet had made it. The last of the Tlixian ships were safely out of the danger zone, moving away from the dying sun. Admiral Veros exhaled slowly. The mission was over. The Tlixians had been saved, but at a cost. The final moments of Tlixian would live on in her memory forever. The Resolute and the rest of the human fleet drifted quietly in space, now far from the once thriving world of Tlixian. The system, once filled with life, was now a graveyard, a shattered planet, and a dying star, reduced to nothing more than a glowing memory. Admiral Veros stood at the command center, her hands clasped behind her back. The silence in the room felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on her chest. It had been hours since the evacuation had been completed, but the finality of the mission still hung in the air. The Tlixians were safe, but the price of their survival had been steep. "Report," Veros ordered, her voice quiet but firm. Lieutenant Carson turned to her. "The last of the Tlixian ships are safely in orbit around the nearby system. We've established a refugee base for them, but it's going to take time to integrate them into the new world. They've lost everything: homes, cities, families. There's a lot of rebuilding to do." Veros nodded, her face softening for a moment. "They'll rebuild. They have to." Commander Samara spoke next. "Radiation levels around the Tlixian system are still dangerously high. The planet's collapse has caused a massive wave of energy to spread throughout the region. We'll need to avoid it for the time being. But we've received a distress signal from one of the nearby systems. It seems to be an alien species in trouble. They're asking for help." Veros raised an eyebrow. "Do we know who they are?" "Not yet, Admiral," Samara replied. "It's a small signal, weak and fading, but it's the only one we've received in this sector." Veros thought for a moment. The fleet had given everything to save the Tlixians. They were exhausted, but the humans had a reputation for their willingness to act, even when things seemed hopeless. And it seemed that once again they were being called to help. "Send a scout ship to investigate. If they need help, we'll give it to them. But we need to rest first. The crew's been through a lot." "Yes, Admiral," Samara said. Veros turned to look out the window, the dark expanse of space stretching before her. She couldn't shake the image of Tlixian, now just a lifeless rock. A sense of loss weighed on her, but they had saved as many as they could. The Tlixians had a future now, and humanity had given them that. "Admiral, we've received a message from the Tlixian leadership," Carson interrupted her thoughts. "They want to speak with you." Veros straightened. "Put it through." The screen flickered, and Olvar appeared, his face worn but grateful. "Admiral Veros, on behalf of my people, I want to thank you. You saved us. We were not sure if we deserved it, but you didn't give up on us." Veros' expression softened. "You didn't need to deserve it. We did what was right." Olvar nodded slowly. "We will never forget what you've done. You have earned our trust, and we will not forget our new allies." The Resolute and the other human ships had left the Tlixian system behind, their course set for the nearby refugee colony. Admiral Veros sat in her command chair, staring at the vastness of space before her. The mission to save the Tlixians had been a success, but there was still much work to be done. As she looked out at the stars, she couldn't help but wonder how the Tlixians would rebuild. They had lost everything, but they had also gained something they hadn't had before: a chance at a new life. "Admiral," Lieutenant Carson called from his station, "we've entered the refugee system. The first of the Tlixian ships are preparing to dock." Veros nodded. "Good. Let's get them settled. The last thing they need is more chaos. Soon, the fleet arrived at the refugee world, a lush green planet far from the dying sun of Tlixion. The Tlixians were greeted with warmth and relief. They had a place to call home again, a place to rebuild their lives. But even as they settled in, they knew that they would have to start from scratch. Everything had to be rebuilt. Cities, farms, families. But they were alive, and they were free. "We've given them more than just a home," Veros said to her crew as they watched the refugees being escorted to their new habitats. "We've given them a future." Commander Samara spoke up, "And we've shown them that there's hope. Even in the darkest times, there's always a way forward." Veros smiled faintly. "That's what makes us human. We never give up." The humans spent the next few weeks helping the Tlixians settle into their new world. Supplies were delivered, shelters were built, and healthcare teams worked tirelessly to tend to the injured and the sick. The Tlixians were grateful, but there was a quiet understanding between them and the humans. The bonds of trust that had been formed on the battlefield of Tlixion would never be broken. One day, as Veros walked through the refugee camp, she met with Olvar, the Tlixian leader. His expression was one of gratitude, but also determination. "Admiral," Olvar said, bowing his head slightly, "we will never forget what you did for us. But we are not helpless. We will rebuild. We have learned much from you, and we will carry your lessons forward. We are no longer the people who waited for help. We are the people who will help others." Veros looked at him, impressed. "You've learned well. You'll rebuild stronger than before." Olvar smiled. "With your help, we have learned the value of unity and strength, and we will never forget that we owe our survival to the bravery of the human race." Veros extended her hand. "And we will never forget you." As Veros returned to her ship, she felt a deep sense of pride. The mission had been difficult, and the cost had been high, but the humans had done what they had always done best. They had given hope where there was none. The Tlixians were safe. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. "Admiral, the fleet is ready to depart," Lieutenant Carson reported. "Where to next?" Veros looked out at the stars. "Wherever we're needed. There are always people who need our help, and we'll be there." With that, the Resolute powered up its engines, and the fleet set off into the vast unknown, ready for whatever challenge lay ahead.